Okay, so good afternoon everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. As you can see, I'm talking about people aspect of predator control. And I should say at the outset that some of what I'm going to present is an ecologist's perspective of this issue, but I also will be showing results from some colleagues who are genuine card-carrying social scientists, so you'll get some truth. Okay, so a few things I want to cover in this talk. How much effort's needed for effective pest control, and I'll be using Cape to City as the example, but I think the approach can be used more widely. I want to show you some results of what we know about landholders' attitudes to pest control in the Cape to City footprint, how that compares, or how Hawke's Bay in particular, compares to these sorts of attitudes across the rest of New Zealand. And finally, I want to look at some overseas research, which sort of is a bit of a benchmark for what's happening in Cape to City, but also provides some indication of how things might go in the future for looking at this aspect of pest control in New Zealand. Okay, you've all seen this map. This is the Cape to City footprint, but it's not the outline that I want you to look at. It's all those fine grey lines that are the property boundaries. That's the bit I'm interested in today. It's a biggish area, and as Al mentioned, there are over 160 properties in there, and they range in size considerably, from large working farms, of course, through to quite small lifestyle blocks. So we wanted to find out how effective control has to be across this area, taking into account the wide diversity of people and property sizes in this area. So we've done that with a computer model. Across this area, we simulated in a computer typical numbers of cats, ferrets and stoats. They're not at maximum density that's possible for this area, but it's what we would expect to see in this area at the moment. And we've got to take into account what the knowledge we have from studies all around New Zealand, the sort of home range sizes of these animals, their recruitment rates, how far they move. And also we wanted to take into account migration into the area, because there are no protected boundaries on the western side of this area, so we need to take that into account. This work was done a couple of years ago and has now been published. Those animals were randomly distributed across the area, and I should say that anyone that went to Audrey Lustig's presentation earlier today will realise that these sort of models can be improved significantly. So this is really just a first cut at this problem, and they will be improved in the future with better simulation models of the way pests behave in this landscape. So what we did in the simulation model, we simulated the initial knockdown. Campbell talked about this right on the first day, an intensive control to varying degrees, but that didn't matter so much in the long run, and that was followed up by maintenance control using this network of traps that Al just described. So there are kill traps, they're spaced right throughout roads and within the area. And in the modelling, we take into account the effectiveness of these traps at removing ferrets, cats and stoats. Okay, so I guess what we were really interested in is what happens if not everybody in the area participates in the program. What level of participation is essential for pest control to be effective? And I guess as Al just mentioned, suppose hypothetically there's a part of the landscape where for some reason pest control is not possible. That could potentially act as a source of breeding of animals to move into the remaining area and reduce the effectiveness of the overall program. So in discussions with the project team, we examined 4 scenarios. At that stage, this is 2 years ago, it looked like 2 properties may not sign up. And so that was considered to be the status quo situation, where just those 2 particular properties were excluded from predator control and everybody else was involved. We looked at situations where clusters of lifestyle block owners may or may not be involved in pest control. And there could be a whole range of reasons why that might happen. There were 5 clusters of properties, of lifestyle properties in this area, and we excluded one or two or three of those clusters. there's obviously concern, well, you'd expect that the large properties would have a particularly big influence on the outcome of pest control. There were 7 particularly large properties, and we looked at the effects of 1, 2, 3 or 4 of those large properties not participating. Of course, the other option is if a property doesn't participate, it might be possible to simply move the traps across the road to the adjacent property that is where the landowner is part of the program, and that might be a way to compensate for some people missing out. So we examined that as a scenario as well. Okay, so I'll show you the results, and these are results of the computer simulations of how many predators you would have in that area after the initial knockdown and another 5 years of maintenance control. That's maintenance control by the property owners. So these are the scenarios. On the y-axis in each case, for example, here is the number of ferrets, starting with 200 initially, and after 6 years, this is the benchmark with everybody being involved, all 100% complying or being part of the program, and removing where ferrets are removed, and there's maintenance control. It's not eradication. There's continual immigration into this area, and of course traps aren't perfectly effective. There's only a probability that animals will be caught. Again, this is this is what would happen with cats if there was 100% of the area involved, and the other one for stoats. Right, wait a minute. The next one is what we call the status quo. Those 2 particular properties which were sort of in the northern part of the area, what would happen if they weren't involved? In fact, it turned out, as far as the simulation model was concerned, it didn't really matter too much. So it was a bit of a red herring. It appeared to be at this stage. It didn't make a huge difference to the outcome after 6 years. The next one looked at 3 levels of clusters of lifestyle blocks properties being removed, and they made no difference. And in a way that makes sense for these sorts of predators that are highly mobile, moving over large areas. If there's no traps on some of these lifestyle blocks, there was a reasonably good chance these animals would be caught nearby. So the lifestyle block people don't appear to be a big issue for Cape to City. You might want to involve them for other reasons, but they're not as important as people thought they were initially. The next scenario was the outcome of large properties not being involved. So if 4 out of 7 randomly selected large properties were not involved in the program, that had a huge effect on the outcome. That's this example here. This is the median value. Gives you some idea of the uncertainty in the outcome, but there's a huge difference between 100% involvement and some of these large properties not being involved. So they're absolutely critical. That's 4 large properties not being involved, 3 not being involved, 2 and 1, and so on. So obviously they're the key. They're the critical people in this community and in this particular case. The 4th scenario was what happens if you could compensate for that to some extent by simply shifting traps across the road to an adjacent property that was participating, and to some extent you can compensate. So you can make adjustments, and you could possibly deal with that to some extent another way. So this gave us some idea at the outset. This was before the predator control was rolled out. It gave us some idea of the level of participation we needed to be aiming for. And I guess at that stage we just had these scenarios to work with, but really what we need to do is have a better idea of whether or not people really would become involved. So prior to predator control being rolled out, a social survey was conducted of the attitudes of landholders to this whole program in the Cape to City footprint. This survey was done by Becky Niemak, a social scientist. She works at Stanford University, and she used a mail-out questionnaire and in some cases in interviews. She asked a whole range of direct questions like how much, quantitative questions, how much of your land, how big is your property, what's it being used for, how much control do you do, how much of it's controlled, and statements like do you agree or disagree with a particular statement? And I'll show you some examples. She also asked their opinions, people's opinions on a whole range of issues, and she got qualitative responses, and I'll show you some of those too. The sample size, she got about just under a 25% response rate to the survey, which is probably pretty good. 28 of those were inside the Cape to City area, and the others were outside, 40 outside. Now, we'd expect them to be similar at this stage because Cape to City really hadn't got underway, but this was a benchmark for future comparison. The sample size is pretty broadly representative of rural landowners in Hawke's Bay. There were some differences. So, for example, the ages of these respondents were on average a little bit older than what's typical across Hawke's Bay, but broadly speaking, they were fairly typical. Okay, so what are some of the responses? The first panel on the top there shows the proportion of people, of the respondents, who agreed with the statement that stoats, ferrets and cats pose a significant threat to native birds and animals. So you can see that there's overwhelming agreement with that statement, and that's typical of what we see with these surveys. Edie McDonald showed similar results yesterday. So there's a really strong appreciation and understanding that this is a big issue. The one on the lower panel is really more of a question about economic benefits, people's perceptions of whether or not there be economic benefits from removing cats. Remember that cats are important in the toxoplasmosis management. So you'd sort of expect some variation here. People who run sheep would be particularly concerned about that, and perhaps other landowners might not. We really want to know what influences people's attitudes. So the top graph are what's called injunctive social norms. So this is where people feel that the people that they know, their friends, their family, might be influencing them either to be involved or perhaps not to be involved in pest control. It's a sort of social pressure, if you like, on people's attitudes. And it's whether, so the statement was, people I know care about whether I do predator control on my property. So it's this sort of issue of caring, and we get quite a mixed response. A lot of people said yes, I am aware of what other people think, and that does affect the way I think. A few people, of course, say that they're not affected. But it's quite mixed, and it's well worth knowing. The lower graph are what we call descriptive social norms. That's where simply it isn't people feeling pressure from their acquaintances. It's simply that they know that what's going on, and that's part of their decision making. They're not being pressured, but simply knowing what's happening. And a lot of people say, okay, I know what's going on, and to some extent that's influencing my decision, but a few people claim not to be influenced at all. We asked people's attitudes their views on whether or not controlling predators would create more problems. For example, would it allow rabbit numbers to increase? And you can see the distribution of views. Some people were strongly agreeing that this would create rabbit problems. Other people thought not. There has been some work on this. For example, Grant Norbury, who's talked at this conference, and a colleague, Chris Jones, reviewed all the literature, what's known about this problem in New Zealand and Australia. And their conclusion is that almost certainly it's unlikely that predator control will make much difference to rabbit numbers in Hawke's Bay. But we could keep tabs on that. And I think Andrea Byron might be talking about these sort of issues later this afternoon. Okay, another concern is that perhaps the predator control is going to take out my pets. Again, an interesting distribution of attitudes. Some people highly concerned about that, and some people not concerned at all. And I guess this is an issue that the Cape to City program needs to take into account. It's clearly a strong attitude, a strong attitudes expressed there by some people. Then it's the question of whether or not people are likely, remember this is at the outset, we were asking people whether they were likely to become involved in the maintenance control. And at that stage, well, I'm not quite sure what's happening now, they've got a choice of whether or not they would do it themselves or whether or not they would prefer to have a professional operator come in and do it for them. The top graph shows people's likelihood of, or expressed likelihood of doing the predator control themselves in the maintenance phase. Some people likely to do it, others not so. Other people preferring, in the lower panel, saying that they would probably prefer to have a professional contractor come in and do it for them. Again, that helps with the planning for Cape to City. There were quite a few other attitudes expressed, and some of them were rather interesting. People were asked whether or not they thought it was likely to be successful. So remember, this is a couple of years ago, before all the publicity about predator-free New Zealand. So some people were fairly sceptical. They thought it's going to be too difficult, the predators are too mobile, too wary, the terrain's too difficult. Some people were concerned about everybody being involved, and the view was that unless everybody is involved, this won't work. It's got to have everybody involved. There were concerns about this issue of perverse outcomes, the imbalance that if you remove predators, rabbits will increase and there'll be a huge problem for agriculture. And people talked about increases in rats and pakeko as well. One thing that was quite strongly expressed by a few people was this issue of equity. The view that why should the particular landholders in the Cape to City footprint have to bear the cost when the whole community is benefiting, particularly nearby urban areas? And they felt that it was important that the cost is at least there's a contribution to the cost from everybody. Okay, so that's our initial survey. There'll be follow-up surveys later on during the Cape to City program to see whether attitudes have changed at all or whether they've become more entrenched. It's sort of interesting to see how Hawke's Bay compares to the rest of New Zealand in these sorts of attitudes. In 2015, a colleague at Manaki Whenua, Pike Brown, conducted a survey of rural decision makers. This is mostly farmers, right across New Zealand. It's an online survey. In that particular survey, he had over 2,500, 3,000 respondents, so it's a big sample size, not quite as big as what Edie got, but pretty big. And in that survey, this was the first of these surveys that asked questions about pest control. He asked, what are the pests on your farm? He asked people to tell him that. And then he said, okay, if you're controlling pests on your farm, what's the main reason for doing it? Is it to reduce damage to production, which is what I would expect most people to be considering? Or is the primary reason to protect native birds and animals on your farm or the bush? Or is it for disease control, an obvious question in the case of possum management? Okay, so just the animals considered to be pests on the farm, shown in these numbers here. As you'd expect, most farmers identified possums are right up there as a key pest. Rabbits, rats, mustelids, and cats, and then a whole range of other pest species which were often more localised, like wallabies, for example. So there's a big awareness. These are the key pests that farmers identified on their properties. Okay, now the interesting bits are what it looks like across the country. So this is Pike's data, split into regions across New Zealand, and the blue part of the pie chart shows farmers who said their primary reason was to reduce damage by pests on their farm. The green segment is to protect native biodiversity, and the purple is a range of other things, for example, disease and a few other possibilities. Hawke's Bay is the middle on the left, and you can see in Hawke's Bay that there's a large segment of green. There's a high awareness of the problems of pests on native biodiversity, and many farmers in Hawke's Bay saying that's the main reason we want to control pests. There's a lot of regional variation, of course, and I'm not quite sure why that is, but we can guess. We got some indication. In the next, you might want to see where you fit in for people come from elsewhere in New Zealand. There's pretty high interest in protecting native biodiversity on the west coast, for example, Wellington, Northland. We heard about Northland this morning. Other areas less so. Why would that be? Well, hang on, that's better. it could well be because of the different uses, different production by farmers in different areas. Obviously, predators probably affect horticulture a little less than some other uses of land. So depending on the type of production on a farm, there appear to be patterns across the whole country in attitudes to pest control. And again, this is focusing on this, in this case, the main reason why farmers said they won't do pest control. So this was in 2015. Pike does these every 2 years. The 2017 survey went out in September. I haven't seen the results yet. And because of the big interest in predator control, Pike's asked more questions about this issue. So he's asked questions about different types of farm management relating to native biodiversity, not just predator control, but weed control, revegetation and so on. He's asked for reasons why farmers might not want to control pests on their property, and which species are controlled, of course, and more broader questions about the types of methods involved. So some of this pest control is just baiting for rats around the farm home, which is probably not going to have a large effect on biodiversity broadly across a farm. So we need to get a bit more information about exactly what type of control is going on. And we'll see fairly soon what the results, and they'll be available online, publicly available. Okay, just briefly, there's been a little bit of work overseas that's, I think, quite relevant to what's going on in New Zealand. This is a really nice review paper done in Australia of the factors that affect people's management of wildlife. This is farmers' wildlife. It happens to be in Australia, and it sort of looks at a whole range of attributes that influence people's involvement in pest animal management. First of all, there's people's capability of doing it. You know, have they got the resources, the physical? You know, are they physically able to do it? Do they have the financial resources? Do they have the opportunity? Are there resources available to them that they can easily get at? Or, you know, is there technology available for them to do it, for example? And thirdly, the motivation. You know, what drives that? And that's an internal process. And how important is that in influencing whether people are involved in pest management? So they've analysed all these factors, and they have got a rather nice table looking at different sorts of interventions that affect the capability, the opportunity and the motivation. It might be a little bit hard to read this, but I hope you can see it. So those factors are listed in the left-hand side of the table: capability, opportunity and motivation. And across here, a whole range of interventions that are possible. Things like education programs that you'd expect to affect people's internal decision-making processes. Things like enablement, making sure tools are available, which might affect their physical capability of doing pest control and so on. Coercion, which could be the big stick. You know, once 75% of people have signed up, everybody has to sign up. Okay, so they identified a whole range of factors that are available for people to influence what's going on, or for regional councils, for example. So what's Cape to City doing? So there's new technology coming on, like the wireless stuff that Bruce has been talking about. Clearly that affects people's enablement to do pest control. And so that's a tick. You know, Cape to City is making moves in that area and possibly could do some more. There's been a lot of publicity over the last 2 years, so clearly that we would expect that that sort of persuasive information to be affecting people's motivation. In fact, there are a whole range of activities that are going on in Cape to City that cross pretty much the whole spectrum, and there are probably others I don't know about. There's a schools program providing education materials. There's obviously council support, we've heard about that. Council regulations, we've heard about that in the last talk before Al's. Habitat restoration is very much part of environmental management. We've heard about that, that's going on in Cape to City. Professional pest control, the category called modelling isn't computer modelling that I was talking about, it's simply showing people how to do something. It's providing an example, of how it can be done, And that's being done in Cape City. So the Cape City program and other programs across New Zealand are ticking a lot of these boxes in helping people get involved. And this sort of paper provides a nice structure, I think, to seeing where there are opportunities in the future to fit in additional interventions that might increase people's capability, their capacity and their motivation to be involved in predator control. So just to summarise, the first part of the modelling work that I showed really showed the importance of large properties, at least in the Cape City area, of affecting the success of the predator control program. It's a sort of modelling that can be rolled out across anywhere in New Zealand, can be done anywhere. In fact, Audrey Lustig is going to do it, I hope, for the whole of Hawke's Bay and possibly for other areas of New Zealand. So it gives us a first cut at trying to understand how much of uptake we have to have for effective pest control for these sorts of predators that often are very wide-ranging. Becky Niemack's work, initial survey in Cape City, showed a widespread support for predator control. Really, people understand the problem, they're keen to get behind it, but there were some concerns that need to be addressed. There were concerns about freeloaders, the view that everyone has to participate, otherwise it's not fair. And there are some concerns about perverse outcomes, which of course need to be considered, and I think Andrea was going to be talking about them later. The national survey is interesting. It was really that one in 2015. Shows that Hawke's Bay is up there, probably one of the leaders across the regions in New Zealand. It'll be really interesting to see how that changes, if that's changed at all, in 2017, particularly with the heightened awareness of predator-free New Zealand 2050. And I guess the last part, looking at that analysis from overseas as a framework, it's pretty clear that the Cape City team is ticking a lot of the boxes in providing the support necessary for farmers, landholders in Cape City to get involved. And I think it sort of provides guidelines for how this sort of program might be extended out more broadly. Thanks.